If you're an American conservative, you know that the societal values we hold sacred are under attack. They are hanging in the balance. How can you protect those values? By staying informed. The Closing Argument will deliver news and supporting evidence you need to support and defend those values. Here's Paul Smith.
Good morning. This is Paul Smith, your host on The Closing Argument. In this podcast, we will discuss some of the important and controversial political, moral, and legal issues that affect us and our families today. Some of the things we discussed are politically incorrect, and this may offend some of the socialist progressives, but we need to discuss them anyway. They pertain to our liberties. They're important to establish the truth, and we need to let the world know that there are many of us who challenge some of the views that are gaining wide acceptance in our schools, our media, and our government, but which are not right. Today, we're going to talk about the September 6th committee, the House Select Committee on the September 6th activities, and this is an update on it. Now, this is being recorded in the middle of July 2022. The House Select Committee just finished its seventh publicly broadcast hearing on their investigation. I use the word investigation, but it's really kind of strange. The reason I say that strange because from the very outset, this commission, its purpose is not so much an investigation as to find evidence to support their predetermined conclusion that Trump is a scumbag, that he led an insurrection on January 6th to try to overthrow the 2020 election, and that he tried to overthrow the United States government. They want the DOJ to bring criminal charges against him. They accuse him at the beginning of every hearing of causing an insurrection that threatened democracy. And anyone who participated with him, they want to label domestic terrorists and who also threaten our democracy. These hearings, and I have watched a few of them, I have not watched all of them, but I've watched enough so that I've come away with a couple of conclusions that I think everyone ought to take a minute and acknowledge. Now, we are used to seeing hearings that have a purpose to get at the truth. And so we're used to hearings where you'll hear one side and then the other. We're used to seeing cross-examination of witnesses and evidence that go back and forth as they challenge statements. But what we're hearing and seeing with the commission is something that is not after unknown facts. Their stated purpose at the beginning of all of the hearings I have seen is to prove that Trump was responsible for the insurrection, they call it, at the Capitol, that he's responsible for attempting to overthrow our democracy. And they say how terrible this was. That is different from a hearing where you have an impartial fact finder who states, well, we're going to see, what the evidence is. This commission announces through Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger and Chairman Benny Thompson virtually every time they've already found these things on the part of Trump, and they're using this much like the other two impeachments, even though they may not get any referral to the Department of Justice, but they at very least want to smear Trump. Now, part of the reason this has become problematic is about half the nation is supportive of Trump. About half the nation believes there were problems in the elections, but apparently they were not established by the different states, and so that's the end of it. Nothing I can do about it. I want to talk a little bit about, first of all, the programming. And you'll recall that the committee hired the executive, I think it was from ABC News, he may have been a retired executive, to try to make their show appealing to the public. And of course, the committee got some flack because of that. Actually, the ratings of the committee proceedings have been terrible. And I'll tell you one reason why. There is no suspense. Everybody knows what the committee is trying to prove, and there's no suspense. Now, if the committee honestly was wondering, what the outcome would be, that might be different. But they're so anxious to convict Trump, at least in the eyes of the public, that there's no suspense whatsoever, and therefore there's no interest. It's just we're just watching these people try to dig up, rather desperately try to dig up whatever evidence they can that might damage Trump and might show that he did something wrong. Now, I want to talk about 2 or 3 or 4 of the hearings and what has happened. One hearing, I think one of the first ones, they asked Officer Caroline Edwards to testify. And she apparently, on that day at the Capitol, was overpowered by the crowd, and she testified that she was knocked unconscious. And one of the things she said was that this was like being in a war zone. I think those were her words. And I remember when I heard that, my thought was, you clearly have never been in war. We know now that some of the people carried weapons, but most of what you saw there initially for months, I had no idea that anyone had any weapons. It was just a crowd that got out of control. This was not a war zone. The one casualty was Ashley, I forget her last name, who was shot by a Capitol policeman. Next, in one of the other hearings, they brought in some of the Department of Justice employees and officials who were in charge after Barr resigned, and when Trump was in December, especially when he was trying to decide what he should do. And Trump wanted the Department of Justice to bring actions going after what he said was fraud in the elections. Now, there's a couple in the hearing, the total focus was on the Department of Justice and what they should or should not do. The focus was not on what the states did or should have done or what mistakes they made. This was only on the federal approach to any election irregularities. And the reason I point this out is because I agree with President Trump's aides and lawyers that there really wasn't much for the federal government to do. But that doesn't mean that there was not something for the states to do. And it was just an alternative avenue that Trump was approaching. And as he proposed that he was going to appoint Jeffrey Clark, I think he was going to make him Attorney General, but he was going to appoint him to a very high post in the Justice Department. When people got wind of that, virtually all of the legal people who were helping the administration threatened to resign. And the committee hearing pointed this out, that none of the legal minds thought that it was appropriate for legal action to be brought by the Department of Justice, and they would have resigned. Consequently, Trump did not appoint Clark, and he didn't make them do any action, and the better minds prevailed. And so it's interesting, while the hearing, in at least an hour or two that I listened to, they're saying how Trump insisted on this and that, and it wasn't until there were several meetings they finally prevailed in dissuading him from taking any action like that. Consequently, he didn't. He did what the best legal minds recommended. So this may show that Trump is unreasonable and maybe bring out some negative things about him, but ultimately he did the right thing. Another hearing featured Cassidy Hutchinson, who had been supportive of Trump, but who they brought in who would give a lot of hearsay evidence of things that she had heard others say. and that reflected badly on Trump, such as that he wanted to go to the Capitol. His driver of the beast, they called it, said, no, we're going to the White House. And Hutchinson said she heard that Trump leaned forward and tried to take control of the wheel, and ultimately they did not take him to the Capitol, where the riots were underway. And so there are some other things that are kind of negative of Trump, some things he said. But interesting, once again, these things show some contention, some disputes, but there's nothing in here, there was nothing in there that would support Trump doing something illegal in terms of an insurrection or sedition. And then furthermore, no sooner had the testimony come out than there were reports that some of the Secret Service men who actually were involved disputed her version of what happened. And so the commentary immediately was, well, if the House committee knew all this, why didn't they call someone who could testify of these things directly instead of just bringing in hearsay evidence, which wouldn't be admissible in court anyway? And so the net effect of that hearing was, again, to further show that this was not a legitimate committee sincerely seeking the truth, that they had predetermined results that they wanted to achieve, and they were just looking desperately for evidence that could support it. Now, one of the hearings also focused on the attempt by Trump to get what they called is fake electors who would go and vote from a different state. I believe Arizona was the state. I could be wrong. And they brought in Eastman, and they talked about how he took the Fifth Amendment a number of times. And frankly, I did not watch a lot of this one, but historically, there have been a number of times in our history, our nation's history, when there have been more than one set of electors from a state presenting themselves when the votes were to be counted in early January, and at which time Congress has to decide, which ones to represent. And this would be done because someone asserts that there was an illegality in electing the electors. So there certainly has to be an opportunity to challenge the electors, and that's one thing that could have happened on January 6th. So the fact that Trump was involved in trying to get a different set of electors present to represent the position of a state, I mean, that in and of itself, to me, doesn't present a serious problem. I guess he could have done something wrong in attempting to do that, but ultimately, I don't think any people presented themselves. I don't think it ever came to fruition. And the fact that Trump may have considered doing something that turned out he didn't do, I don't want to condemn that too much. The whole process is extremely complicated, and the president needs to have the ability to propose and think things through, and sometimes he'll have ideas that are bad, and when that happens, they need to be stopped. But the mere fact that he explored this, to me, doesn't amount to anything yet. Now, maybe ultimately they'll come up with some crime. If it's possible to come up with a crime, they certainly will want to do that, and I'm sure someone will pursue it. But the mere fact that these, quote, fake electors were discussed doesn't concern me so much. Also, there are several other problems. Let me just mention one of the purposes of the committee, and they don't state it as a direct purpose, but they've already stated it in different words, and that is that their belief that it is treasonous to challenge election results, and that those who challenge election results are basically domestic terrorists. So the committee would like to condemn Senators Cruz and Hawley for their efforts to try to postpone the count, and tried on January 6th, that evening, tried to delay a vote so that certain state irregularities.